So next we're going to cover the lymphatic system and immunity. So your lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is important for maintaining the consistent level of fluid that's around each cell in your body. So that's just because each cell in your body, even outside of your circulatory system, has some fluid around it. And you can have too much or too little fluid. So your lymphatic system works to carry away the excess fluid, but not take away too much to make sure that there is a homeostasis of that fluid in between your cells. So your blood plasma, what happens is that it filters out of your capillaries into the spaces in between those tissue cells. This liquid at that point is actually called interstitial fluid because it's no longer in your blood capillaries. Most of this fluid will just return to circulation by flowing back into the capillary walls, and that's just back into normal circulation. But what cannot flow back into your capillary walls, or what does not flow back into your capillary walls, is called lymph. So lymph is a fluid in the tissue spaces that carries a lot of protein molecules and other larger substances that will eventually end up back in the bloodstream. The lymphatic vessel is a vessel that carries the lymph back so that it will eventually re-enter the blood. And they have only a one-way form of movement. So instead of being that kind of circulatory system that that your cardiovascular system has, where it's very circular, lymph is just one way. It's like a one-way street. So your lymphatic capillaries are very tiny, blunt-ended tubes that are just distributed throughout your tissues. They're very microscopic in size, and the walls, a lot like capillaries, are only one cell layer thick. But the difference between your lymph vessels, or your lymph capillaries, and regular capillaries in your cardiovascular system are that your lymph capillaries, the cells that make those walls, have a very form fit between them. So instead of being a very tight-knit cellular wall, it's almost more like a mesh with very big holes. So they're very porous. And those porous walls allow for larger molecules to enter the vessel, so those larger molecules can be carried back to your circulatory system. And the interstitial walls, also the ones that are located in your intestines, those lymphatic capillaries there, are also used to transport fat, because fat can be some pretty big molecules themselves, and your lymphatic capillaries have big enough holes to transport them, to take them up into that circulation and transport them. So for the vessels, they're divided into two major vessels where they dump back into your vena cava. So there's your right lymphatic duct. And your right lymphatic duct drains the lymph from the right upper extremity and the right side of your head, neck, and your upper torso. And that drains into your right subclavian vein, which then dumps into your superior vena cava. And then you have your thoracic duct, and that's the largest of the two vessels, and that drains the lymph from the remaining part of the body, which is about 3/4 of your body. And that drains into your left subclavian vein, which also dumps then into your superior vena cava. So here you can see the picture where your right lymphatic duct just drains this one little quarter of the body here, and your thoracic duct does the rest of the body. So for a disorder of your lymphatic system, there's lymphedema. Lymphedema is a swelling, also known as edema. Edema is a swelling that's not inflammatory in process. So it's not that your blood vessels there are inflamed and red and trying to attack something. It's that they're swollen. It's more of a cool, just fluid that's building up there. And so it's a swelling of the tissues that's caused by a blockage of that lymphatic vessel. So that lymphatic vessel is supposed to be draining that excess fluid. So if it's blocked, it just causes a buildup of that fluid, or that just cool fluid in whatever part of the body that lymphatic vessel was supposed to be draining. Now, lymphangitis is kind of a subdivision of lymphedema, and that's when it's actually an inflammatory process of the lymphatic vessel. And that's normally characterized by, you can see these very thin red streaks that are displaying where the infectious region is, and they normally are streaks along where the lymphatic vessels run. And then another type of lymphedema is elephantitis. Elephantitis is very rare, and it's a very severe form of lymphedema of normally your lower extremities. And what happens is that it results from a parasite infection that actually blocks the lymphatic vessels, causes a very large swelling of the lower extremities, and causes the skin to become very thick and callous looking. So that is a picture of lymphedema. You can see how much bigger one leg is than the other, even though both legs actually are quite swollen. This one is much bigger. This is lymphangitis. You can see where those lymph vessels right there, especially that one, are very red and swollen. And here is a picture of elephantitis. So extremely swollen. This is a long-term swelling. It takes very, very long time to develop, and the skin becomes very thick and calloused. So, lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are these small, sort of bean-shaped things that are along your lymphatic system, that they're dispersed along your lymphatic vessels, and their whole purpose is to filter your lymph. So they're located in these little clusters, and their functions really include defense, and that they form white blood cells. And that's because they have a mass of lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell, in them, so that they can keep making more of them. So that's why they're really important for your immunity. And your lymph nodes are considered a lymphoid organ. And that's a picture of a lymph node. So you can see here where there are a lot of vessels that are coming in, draining into your lymph node here, where they're filtered, and then they go back out as the one vessel. And then this is someone who's had dye injected, so you can see where there are a lot of lymph vessels coming in, going through a lymph node, and then it comes out as just one or a couple of vessels instead of that large number here. You can see all these little lymph nodes here, more lymph nodes up here. So the flow of lymph, like I said, that the node has several lymphatic vessels that drain into it, and then only a single vessel that drains out of it. And that's just because you have a whole, all those small vessels that are gathering up the fluid from around your body, and then it all gathers together in the lymph node where it's filtered, and then it just goes into one bigger vessel that is coming out on the other side. And then you have lymphadenitis, which is a swelling or tenderness of the lymph nodes. And that normally happens when your body has an infection that it's trying to take care of. And that's because, like we said, that there's some white blood cell formation there. So if your body is sensing something that's coming in and attacking it, and now it's making more white blood cells to try and defend your body, your lymph nodes become swollen with those, with the extra filtering that's happening while your body's trying to take care of whatever the problem is, and with the extra formation of those white blood cells. The other thing that's important to know about lymph nodes is that cancer cells can very easily move through your lymphatic vessels and through your lymph nodes. And that is because your lymphatic vessels, remember we talked about how porous they are, well, that cancer cell, if it's out in your tissue, can just flow into your lymph vessel. And even your lymph nodes, the filter system, doesn't really always take them out, which means that they can get carried to another part of your body, and that's how metastases are formed, because your lymph nodes can carry them to elsewhere in your body. And this is a picture of that, where this is a lymphatic vessel, so see how huge this lymphatic vessel is? And these here are cancer cells. So they are much, much smaller than this lymphatic vessel is, so it's easy to see how they can be transported from one place to another by these vessels. So, lymphoma. Lymphoma is a malignant tumor of your lymph nodes. This is characterized by an enlargement of the lymph nodes, normally of the neck, but sometimes in other regions as well. And normally this type of cancer is followed by anemia, weight loss, weakness, and fever. So it sounds a lot like a few other types of cancer that we covered. Remember when we were talking about cancers of your white blood cells and leukemia? So it sounds a lot like those, right? The thing with lymphoma is that it can be spread pretty easily to other parts of your body, and that's from what we were just talking about, because your cancer cells are carried around so easily in your lymph vessels. There are two types of lymphoma. It's divided into two categories, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it's not that Hodgkin's is really one specific type, and non-Hodgkin's isn't always really similar. It's just that somebody discovered non-Hodgkin's, and then they discovered somebody discovered Hodgkin's, and then they discovered non-Hodgkin's. And so they just sort of classified them that way, even though not all types of lymphoma that are considered non-Hodgkin's lymphoma are the same. So for another organ that's located in your lymphatic system, there's your thalamus. Your thalamus is a small lymphoid tissue organ that's located in your mediastinum, so that's in your chest, remember, around where your heart is. And it plays a vital and central role in your immunity system. And that's because it's going to produce your T lymphocytes and your T-cells. No, I don't really expect you guys to remember T-cells and B-cells. I want you to know that your thalamus has a really big role in immunity. And the reason for that is that this lymphoid tissue just makes those immune cells, but as you age, it is also largely replaced by fat. And that's a process called involution. And that has to do with has in part to do why when we age, our immune system seems to go down. It's because we are losing some of the effectiveness of that part of our immune system. Another important part of our lymphatic or immune system are our tonsils. And that's because there are these three masses of lymphoid tissue that are located around the openings of our mouth and throat, and they serve as the first line defense from the exterior, which is why sometimes they can suffer from a lot of chronic infections. It's because they are our first line of defense. So when an invader is first starting to enter our body, that's the first thing that they're going to encounter, and so your tonsils are really trying to protect you from the outside world. They used to be very common to take out somebody's tonsils if they suffered from tonsillitis or had inflamed tonsils. Now it's really not so common anymore, and it's because it's more understood that they do play a very important role in somebody's immunity. When they would take out somebody's tonsils now, it's more if the pharyngeal tonsils, which are the ones closer to your throat, actually become so swollen that they start to impair breathing. And then you not being able to breathe sort of takes priority over a small part of your immune system. So here you can see where you have your tonsils, and that there are some different kinds of them. So the next lymphatic organ that we're going to cover is the spleen. The spleen is the largest lymphoid organ in the body, and it's located in your upper left quadrant of your abdomen. It's sort of partially up under your rib cage, and this can often be injured by trauma to your abdomen. So it does get injured pretty frequently with an intense trauma. And your spleen functions to include phagocytosis of bacteria. Phagocytosis is like the destroying of bacteria, and also of old red blood cells. Remember how we talked about that when we were talking about red blood cells, that they're destroyed in your spleen? And your spleen also functions as a blood reservoir. So if you need extra blood, your spleen sort of carries its own little backup. Splenomegaly is what it's called when you have an enlargement of the spleen, and if you have to have your spleen removed, it's called a splenectomy. So, immune system. Your immune system works to protect the body from pathological bacteria, foreign tissue cells, and cancer cells. Kind of touched on this earlier. We have a couple different kinds of immunity. There's nonspecific immunity. So nonspecific immunity, this isn't like the defenses that your body builds up, like cells that know to attack other cells. These are just things that everybody has no matter what. And it's not attacking anything specific, it's almost just to keep out harmful things. So your skin's a huge form of defense that we have. And that's because it's literally a mechanical, physical barrier that's going to keep those harmful agents out of your body. Also tears and mucus. And that's because your tears will actually wash away those harmful products, and mucus traps bacteria so that your body can then expel it, kind of like when you cough or sneeze. You're actually expelling mucus-trapped bacteria. And inflammation is the other thing that's nonspecific, and that's because it's actually bringing those cells, your immune cells, to the site. So those immune cells are a specific type of immunity, but the inflammation, the fact that it's kind of calling in the reinforcements to that specific area, is non-specific. So I know a little bit hard to differentiate there, but the cells are specific, but the inflammation isn't. And that's because it's just increasing the blood flow. It's promoting the movement of white blood cells to the site of injury or infection. So specific immunity is the ability of the body to recognize, respond to, and then remember harmful substances or bacteria. So specific immunity can either be inherited or it could also be acquired. Inherited immunity is when it's something that you have from the time of birth. So it's something that your body knows to protect you from the time that you're born. Acquired immunity. This can either be natural or artificial. Natural is when you get exposed to the causative agent. So this would be like if I get exposed to whatever the common cold is for this season. I get exposed to it, I build up an immunity. So now if I spend some time around someone who has a cold, chances are my body's going to say, oh yeah, we've already had that, we know how to kill it. Artificial immunity, this is when we expose you on purpose to the causative agent that has been somehow debilitated. So if this is a vaccine. So when we give somebody a vaccine, we give them kind of a copy of whatever the causative agent is, bacteria, virus, whatever it is, that's either dead or weakened or somehow altered so that it's not really going to make you sick, but it's enough to trigger your body to start making antibodies against it. So that would be artificial, where natural is like actually being exposed to it. So for immune system molecules, one of the most important ones would be antibodies. Antibodies are protein compounds with specific combining sites. So those combining sites are attach the antibodies to whatever the antigen is. So remember when we were talking about red blood cells and blood cell types, antigens are foreign body proteins. And what happens is that the antibodies and the antigens are kind of like puzzle pieces, and if they happen to fit together correctly, that's when your antibodies say, oh yes, attack this one. And so when they do that, they form the antigen-antibody complex, which triggers antibody-mediated immunity. So antigen-antibody complexes actually work they can neutralize toxins. They also clump or agglutinate, remember that from the red blood cell chapter, enemy cells together, and they promote phagocytosis. So phagocytosis is your body destroying those bad cells. So this is just a picture for people who are visual learners. You can see here the antigen, and then you can see the antibody. So it binds with it and activates it, and it locks into place, which causes more of them to come to the area, so more of them bind. And then finally you have phagocytosis, which happens. So you have this cell which comes to the area and starts destroying. It eats up your antibodies and the antigens, so it takes care of them. I always think of it kind of like Pac-Man. Pac-Man's coming around and eating them up so that it destroys them. So phagocytes, that's what that big purple thing was. So for types, there are neutrophils, monocytes, and then your dendrite cells. So neutrophils are very short-lived ones. Monocytes develop into macrophages, which migrate around tissues to Pac-Man, not bacteria. And then your dendritic cells, those are found near external surfaces. And those are more like the red flag alerters. So they're going to say, like, foreign cells here, foreign cells here, foreign cells here. It's kind of like, putting out the SOS to call over those monocytes and the neutrophils, things to come in and attack and eat up that nasty bacteria that's invading. So that's just a picture. So here you can see that these are your bacteria cells. This is actually a red blood cell, I believe. It's getting eaten up. So phagocytes, what they do is they are there to ingest, kind of like we saw those purple ones, is Pac-Manning it around, ingest and destroy those foreign cells or whatever the harmful substances are by phagocytosis. So phagocytosis is just them eating them up. So macrophages and the dendritic cells act as antigen-presenting cells. So that means that when they find those foreign cells and they start to destroy them, they also display the ingested antigens on their outer surface to trigger more immune cells to come to that area, so that more immune cells will come and destroy more of whatever that foreign antigen is. You also have lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are the most numerous type of immune system cell, and they're responsible for the production of antibodies. So they are made when primitive stem cells migrate from your bone marrow, and they go through a couple stages of development and finally turn into B cells. So the development of B cells, the first stage is that the cells develop into immature B cells, which are very small lymphocytes that contain an antibody molecule. And then they become more mature, and after they mature, an inactive B cell migrates to your lymph nodes. And then they become activated when they come in contact with antigens. And then they send a signal to your T cells so that it creates a memory of that. And it creates a memory of that so that if you ever see that same antigen again in your body will recognize it as being foreign, and that it already knows how to make the antibodies to protect you against it. So your T cells, like we just mentioned, those are going to produce the cell-mediated immunity. So there are a couple different kinds here, just like there are a couple different kinds of antibody cells or immune cells that we were talking about before. And this can be cytotoxic T cells, which kill infected or tumor cells by releasing a substance that actually poisons the infected or tumor cells to kill them. There are helper T cells, which release chemicals that attract those activated macrophages so that those can come in and kill the invader cells by phagocytosis. And they also produce chemicals that activate the B cells so that it can make that memory, so that if it knows if it ever sees them again in the future, what they are and how to take care of them. And then there are regulatory T cells. So these ones are important because these come into play after you've killed off the invading bacteria. These ones release a chemical to actually suppress your immune response. So these are the cells that come in after you've taken care of all of the bacteria. You've killed off all the foreign invaders to say, all right, that's enough, stop with the immune reaction. And that's important because if not, you would keep having an immune reaction and your body would just keep attacking even though there was nothing there to attack anymore. So an allergy is triggered by a hypersensitivity to harmless environmental antigens, which your body sees as allergens. And then autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is an inappropriate or excessive response to self-antigens. So this is when those regulatory T-cells aren't working right. They're not coming in and saying, nope, that's enough, stop now, this is part of you, not something foreign. They're not working. So your body is going in and just attacking itself. And this can cause some autoimmune diseases. We've mentioned a little bit about autoimmune diseases before. Another example of one would be systemic lupus. And lupus is what it's normally called, and this is a chronic inflammatory disease that's caused by numerous antibodies that just attack a lot of your tissue. Normally these people have a lot of complications. They normally have a lot of skin issues and weakness, just a lot of problems because their body isn't even very specific. It's just attacking a whole variety of tissues in their body. So this is someone who has lupus. You can see that they're having a whole inflammatory reaction to their own skin cells even. So for another example of hypersensitivity, we have isoimmunity. Isoimmunity is an excessive reaction to the antigens of another human. So this can happen like during pregnancy between mom and fetus. So the Rh system is kind of an example of this, but mom can have a reaction to even other cells in baby, or baby can have a reaction to mom, just depending on what the cells happen to be. And another example of when this oftentimes happens is during tissue transplants, and that's because the tissue in whatever that transplanted organ in doesn't match the tissue of the acceptor body. So your body might actually attack that tissue and say, this isn't mine. And that's why people who have an organ transplant actually go on immunosuppressants to try to prevent their body from rejecting that organ. And then another thing that can happen is congenital immune deficiency, which is a very rare condition. And this results in an improper lymphocyte development before birth, so when the baby is in utero still. And it can cause a severe combined immune deficiency, which is caused by a disruption of stem cell production or stem cell development, which means that they're not going to develop their immune cells properly. And finally, just one quick brief touch on AIDS. AIDS is acquired immune deficiency. So this is something that happens after birth. They're not born with it. It's called acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which is why it's AIDS. And that's caused by the HIV infection, which affects your T-cells. So that's going to bring us to the end of the immune chapter.